Okay, so the Society of Professional Journalists is just like any profession. There are trade organizations that are formed and exist to provide guidelines and criteria and points of thought in the industry. So, this is the Society of Professional Journalists (SPJ) publishes what they call a code of ethics. And contrary to the day and age that we live in, where we hear about fake news and the media's big lie, and news people are lying to us, there actually is an ethical standard for journalists, whether you be print journalist, television journalist, internet journalist. There is a standard code of ethics that professional journalists should adhere to, as prescribed by the SPJ. So, what are we going to do in this class? We're going to learn how to write news stories. These news stories are going to be subjected for publication. Y'all are expected to adhere in your writing standard to the code of ethics as prescribed by the SPJ. And I want to talk through some of that. And like I said, I will provide y'all with links to all of this. I promise Blake after this week the course material is going to be different. This is interesting though that you're in I think the two classes are going to complement each other a whole lot. So I think it'll be a good experience for you. So the preamble to the Code of Ethics is: members of the SPJ believe that public engagement is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. Ethical journalism strives to ensure the free exchange of information that is accurate, fair, and thorough. An ethical journalist acts with integrity. Let me say that again. An ethical journalist acts with integrity. The Society declares these four principles as the foundation of ethical journalism and encourages their use and its practice by all people in all media. A pretty big umbrella statement. So there's four principles here, and we're going to go through them, and we're going to talk through some of the finer points. Number one, seek the truth and report it. Seems pretty basic, right? But what is truth? I mean, we live in a day and time when truth has become somewhat subjective. Truth seems to be what we make it these days. Our job as journalists is to follow the truth, wherever the truth goes. Not to follow opinion, not to follow speculation, not to follow gossip, not to follow intuition, but to follow the truth. And at the core of what we do, that is the core of what we do. Ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. So, a few subheads from that. Number one, take responsibility for the accuracy of your work. Verify information before releasing it. Verify information before releasing it. I will say that twice. Use original sources whenever possible. When we seek the truth and we're accurate in what we're doing, what does that entail? The purpose of all media, of all news, is to tell stories, right? It's to tell stories. We tell the news by telling people stories. And when we do that, we're telling what we see, we're telling what we hear. Okay? We're not telling what we think. We're not telling what your sister thinks. We're not telling what you heard or what this guy said, what you heard this guy said. You are telling what you see and what you hear. Remember that neither speed nor format excuses inaccuracy. I think this is the problem. I think we live in a world, I would say 40 years ago, the world kind of existed on a 24-hour news cycle. That was the day of daily newspapers. And you had an edition come out the next one morning. You had 24 hours until the next. 24-hour cable news, I think, shortened that news cycle. CNN came out in the 1980s, and everybody said that was ridiculous. Like, who would want to watch news 24 hours a day? But they found a market for it. Now, in this day and age of the internet, I would argue that the 24-hour news cycle has been decreased to like a 15-minute news cycle, right? It's like these news companies are just fighting for the next scoop, for the next lead, for the next story. Consequently, I think accuracy falls prey to that sometimes. How many times have you heard breaking news and then an hour later heard the same news organization correcting what they just reported? And news gathering has changed. And a prime example of this, I have a friend, Randy Macon. He owns a couple of weekly newspapers out in West Texas, the Big Lake Wildcat and the El Dorado Success. And the El Dorado, Texas is the site. It's been 10, 12 years ago now, but there was a raid in El Dorado, Texas. So there was a guy named Warren Jeffs. He was a fundamentalist, Mormon, polygamist leader, right? And he had a compound in El Dorado, Texas, where he had, untold number of wives and children, and it was one of these like fundamentalist cult things. It was a weird deal. There is a Showtime documentary called Prophets Pray. If you're interested in the Warren Jeffs story, he's in prison now. And this happened in El Dorado, Texas. It was national, worldwide news. And if you watch Prophets Pray, you're going to see Randy Macon there because he's the guy at the little weekly newspaper in El Dorado that broke this story. And the way he did it, it was kind of funny. He had a friend who was a rancher, and I know some ranchers like this, but this guy was also a pilot, had a small plane, and this rancher would go up and fly his plane around and check his cows, from the plane. That's like a thing. So Randy was with him one day, had his camera, and he saw something on the ground that it was like, it was the first images. What it was Warren Jeffs having the groundbreaking dedication of this temple of his compound. Anyway, the investigation started there, ended up in a huge raid. It was national news. It all started in El Dorado. And so when that happened, when they had the trial there, well, there were two things. Randy published a picture on his website, and the next morning his picture that he took without his photo credit was on the front page of the San Angelo newspaper. So some editor in San Angelo just forgot all about copyright laws and decided, we're going to take this image, And Randy called him on it, and the guy said, well, that's just news gathering these days, which is bullshit. Like it's actually copyright infringement. But anyway, that was the experience that Randy had with it. And two, the national media descended on El Dorado, Texas. And he said at first it was really neat. You had the NBC and CBS and CNN guys there. And he opened up his office and gave them internet hookups and a coffee pot and was just really having fun with it. But he said what he saw was, one, they started stealing his sources and his material, like the guy in San Angelo. And two, they started getting the story wrong. And he said to the point where he would just say a household name at CNN. I have to think maybe it's Anderson Cooper or somebody. Was in his office. He wouldn't tell me who. But this guy, whoever this person was, he said, Randy, you don't understand. You're a weekly newspaper. You have the luxury of getting the story right. We have to get it first. So that's where this push to getting news first is, I think, a problem. We have the opportunity here in this class that we're only publishing so many stories a semester. We're going to be able to focus on accuracy. We'll talk more about that on Thursday with media literacy, but just, suffice it to say, there's no excuse for having an inaccurate story. If you need more time, you need more time. I've always said I would rather be late to the party and be right. Provide context, okay? Take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting or previewing or summarizing a story. You don't want to oversimplify it, but you don't want to misrepresent it, and you always have to provide context for your story. we can't ever publish a story. Say you have an incident that happens in your community, and maybe this incident is a follow-up or an addendum to something that happened a month ago or a year ago or 5 years ago. And, pretty much you think everybody in town, well, they should know what happened, so this story should make sense. We can't ever assume that our readers know what happened before. We can't ever assume that they have any knowledge of anything leading up to this story. So if that means taking 4 or 5 sentences in your story to kind of give them that background information they need to understand it, then we have to do that. Gather, update, and correct information throughout the life of a news story. This is if you're publishing online and something changes, the story needs to be updated, needs to be corrected. Those corrections need to be made. If you're just print, you're not publishing online, whenever your next print edition is, take the opportunity to correct that story. Be cautious when making promises, but always keep the promises they make. You may be interviewing a source and you've promised that you would only reference them a certain way, or there'd be a certain placement, there'd be a certain deadline met for this story. There's probably promises that you shouldn't promise just because things happen and you can't always keep your promises. But if you do make a promise, make sure you keep it. Identify your sources clearly. The public is entitled to know as much as possible to judge the reliability and motivations of a story. It is not illegal, and some would say not unethical, to list anonymous sources. I think it has to be a pretty extreme circumstance to do that. I think the only time in my career that I have ever quoted somebody anonymously would be maybe in the instance of, or not maybe, the only time I've ever done it was in like a sexual assault case. So like the victim or the family of the victim wanted to be on the record, but maybe they didn't want to be identified. That is the only time I've ever done it. There are Pulitzer Prize winning stories that led to great social change in America that used anonymous sources. It's not illegal, but especially in the community news organizations, you want to be able to identify, who is saying this, who is implying this, and give as much context about that source as you can. We'll talk more about the victim's right to privacy in just a little bit. Diligently seek subjects of news coverage to allow them to respond to criticism and allegations of wrongdoing. We have to tell all sides of the story. And, the prime example is I had a city secretary in a town one time that got, she got convicted of embezzling from the town, and when the story broke and we told the story and all the evidence, she didn't answer the phone and she didn't comment to us, but we had to make that effort. I mean, you have to say, and then sometimes when they don't say anything, that's saying a whole lot. They were unavailable to comment. But you have to try to get them on the record, or you have to show that that you have made that effort. I had a superintendent of a school district one time that in the course of one school board meeting lost 5 of his head coaches in one night against his recommendation. It was like all of a sudden we're looking for 5 coaches, and that superintendent, man, he dodged my calls for about 5 days, and then I finally just left him a message and said, look, I'm just trying to help. I'm not trying to smear what you got going on there. I'm just trying to help you tell your story, and I can help you get your message out there. And he called me right back. Be honest with people. this isn't so much a case of you know, allowing people to respond to criticism, but a matter of telling both sides of the story. And this is hard for the hometown sports guy who's covering the hometown team. You know, if you're doing that right, if you're writing your football story correctly, it's not just about the hometown team. You should go interview the other coach too. You know, you should tell the other team's side of the story too. So try to make an effort to, to tell all sides of the story. Avoid undercover and other serendipitous methods of gathering information unless traditional open methods will not yield vital information to the public. It's not illegal to record a conversation and cite that conversation in a story with the other person who's being recorded having no knowledge that they were being recorded. I mean, in the state of Texas, as long as one person in a conversation knows they're being recorded, it's not illegal. Is it unethical? Probably. We should. There have been, again, Pulitzer Prize policy-changing stories that resulted from a reporter going in undercover. Resulted under those circumstances, but you want to avoid them at all costs. We've occasionally here at the TNS may encounter a little bit of controversy around the story. We've encountered some that we didn't want to encounter, but when you're are y'all giggling over there? It's always best and most ethical to be honest with people. You may be calling somebody for a story to get them on the record, something they really don't want to talk about, and they say, well, why are you calling? Well, don't lie to them. I mean, tell them. They're going to read the story anyway. Just say, hey, look, we're giving you an opportunity to, to give your side of this or whatever. And they may not, they may hang up on you. I've been hung up on before. But at least they know that it's coming. Just be honest. Just don't lie. That's what my mama always used to say. She still does say that. Be vigilant and courageous about holding those in power accountable. Give voice to the voiceless. That's kind of an old standard. Of holding, folks accountable. I've always said in the newspaper business that I was never out for gotcha journalism. I was never out to, to bring anybody down, but I always was out to give the community the information they needed to make those decisions about those people. Support an open and civil exchange of ideas, even if those views are repugnant to you. Okay? Repugnant. That's a strong word. We don't have to agree with somebody about whom we're writing. We don't have to agree with each other in this room. It's not our job as journalists to agree or disagree with the subject of the story. It's not our job. It's just to tell that story. You're not, if you're doing your job right, you're not always going to agree. We're going to have discussions in this room about stuff we're not going to all agree about. Any of y'all that care, I could probably take a poll right now and ask you, was the Cowboys game Dak's fault or was it not Dak's fault? And probably half this room's going to agree and half's going to disagree, and but that's okay. If we cannot disagree and do it civilly at the university, I don't know where we can. I believe, I haven't looked it up, but I still think it was Oscar Wilde that said, I don't agree with anything that you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. And I think it was Oscar Wilde. I need to check. I need to look it up. But, uh, we just tell the stories. I told this. Blake heard this story earlier. And this, this isn't. We're going to talk in this class about the difference between the editorial page where opinions belong and where news belongs. But this applies to the opinion page too. I mean, I have in my career countless times published opinions with which I did not agree. And I always said if I felt like if I was doing my job correctly, the community wouldn't know what my opinion was, right? We just keep it straight. It was a small town, Whitesboro. You know where Whitesboro is. A couple of years ago, they had a wet-dry vote. Whitesboro had been dry. Most, the county is a dry county, but folks there wanted to sell beer and wine. I've covered a lot of these in a lot of different communities, and it's always, well, what it usually is the people that are against it come out against it. And the churches write letters and buy ads and, save our children and liquor's bad and all that. The people that are for it usually don't say anything, and it usually passes by 80% of the vote. So it's that 20% that's really vocal against it. That's the case we had in Whitesboro. And one of the people that was against it was a man that worked for me, and Dan's in his 80s now, and he's been a newspaper reporter and a Baptist minister, both for over 60 years. He always had a job at a church, had a job in the newspaper. And so just to give a little background on him. And he wrote this column, and he was against it, man. He didn't think it was a good thing. He knew that, I wasn't just a vocal supporter of it, but he knew that I thought that it needed to pass, there wasn't any reason for it not to pass, whatever. So he knew that we didn't agree. And he brought me, he was kind of timid, and he brought me this manuscript, and he said, I wrote this column, and if you don't want to publish it, it's fine, but here's my thoughts on it, and I read, it was an opinion piece. And I said, Dan, this is well written, man. This is a great job. You've got some great sources here, great writing. You make some great points. We're going to publish it this week. He said, oh, so I changed your mind? I said, no, you didn't change my mind. I still don't agree with you, but that doesn't matter. It's not our job to agree. So keep an open mind, and if I'm doing my job right, we're going to disagree on some things. So just know that, and we're still going to be friends. Recognize a special obligation to serve as watchdogs over public affairs and government. Seek to ensure that the public's business is conducted in an open manner and that all public records are open to all. There are places across the country as community newspapers and community news organizations have a harder and harder time getting by. We've all heard about food deserts, right? Where there's places where there's a lack of good food or whatever. There's now a phrase called news deserts. There are communities where there is nobody covering the local news, mostly rural communities. And studies show that when nobody's covering your local news, when nobody's the watchdog, corruption is up, crime is up, suicides sometimes are up, just quality of living is down. And I don't know, has anybody in here taken Intro to Mass Comm yet? Anybody taking a Mass Comm course? So a few, okay. Say what?
So I'm in it right now.
Okay. And who's that with? You don't know. I hope I get to teach it this summer. I love teaching Mass Comm. So that's a lot about, what we talk about there. So in your Mass Comm class, if you haven't taken it yet, you should, if being taught right, hear the phrase the fourth estate. Is anybody familiar with that? So it's actually was coined by a British author, but it applies here in America. We have our three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. And the idea of the fourth estate is that the free press is the fourth unofficial branch of government, that the free press's job is to keep those other three honest. So the fourth estate. When you hear somebody refer to the fourth estate, they're talking about the free press. And our obligation to give people the information that they need. there was a time in the state of Texas for a quorum or a majority of elected officials on a board to meet, it has to be, there's a certain criteria. And say the city council wants to meet, they can't just call everybody up and say, hey, I need you here at 2 o'clock this afternoon or whatever. It has to be, the agenda of what they're talking about has to be posted 72 hours prior to the meeting. Public has to have the right to know what they're talking about. There was a time in one of the communities I was working in that I was appointed to a city council seat, and that's in itself, we'll talk about conflict of interest in a minute. We put some protocols in place for I wasn't the one writing the city council stories about the board I sat on, and I wasn't the one that had the final editorial say over it. But anyway, we had a situation in this town one time where, the mayor called me, and I guess there was some contamination at the water plant. Like the water it wasn't good. And she said, we need to meet down there. I'm like, I'm heading down there right now. We need to get everybody down there. We need to deal with this. And I said, have you called a meeting? I don't care. I'll take the ticket. We got to get together. And I said, well, I'm not going to be a party to it if we can't do this right. I said, give me a minute. Let me call the city attorney and see what the deal is. And there are provisions for that. And it's called calling an emergency meeting. But you still have to post it, but you can post it like 3 hours ahead of time. But there still is a record of it. I called her back and I said, so here's the deal. You need to post this. Call it for later on this afternoon. So that was an example of, although I was on that board, on that council, the journalist kicked in first and foremost. I wasn't going to be a party to anything that conflicted with the public's right to know. So we met at 3 o'clock that afternoon and got the problem fixed, and it was better the next day. But that's make sure that the public records stay open. I could talk all day about public record stories, but I'm not going to bore you with it. Provide access to source material when relevant and appropriate. Source material, that could be your interview notes, that could be your recording of your interview, your whatever you have done to your source, that's your source information to do with a story. There are all different ways to handle this. I know some writers that keep every note for everything they've ever done. I had a lady retire one time, and she'd been at the newspaper for 30 years, and there was 2 filing cabinets full of 30 years worth of story notes, and she had it all, and it was beautiful, and I threw it all away. There are people, I tend to be this person. Once I'm done with the story, once it's published, once it's out there, I throw my notes away. I delete my recordings. I'm not really trying to hide anything. It's just I don't like a lot of paper stacking up. Either is fine, one extreme or the other, or something in the middle. But it's most appropriate that whatever you do one time, you do all the time, okay? Because there have been instances when reporters have been subpoenaed for their notes, and they usually gets overturned, damned old First Amendment and everything. Those district attorneys think they can get copies of your notes, and they really can't. But if I were to get subpoenaed for my notes, I said, well, I don't have any notes. Well, why don't you? Well, I don't keep them. Okay. But if you keep all your notes on one story but destroy your notes on the other, that looks suspicious. So whatever you do, I've had different people over different years do in the same office have different procedures, but it just needs to be consistent. So food for thought there. Boldly tell the story of diversity and magnitude of the human experience. Seek sources whose voices we seldom hear. Diversity is appropriate and important in successful storytelling. So I remember I got to Paris, Texas. I was the editor there for a while, and on top of the 6-day daily newspaper, we also had a monthly magazine, and it was a really high quality magazine. We had fun doing it. Magazines are a different kind of reporting where we're telling stories about the community, less hard-hitting news, feature stories. But it was supposed to be representative of Lamar County, the county we were in. I started looking at this magazine when I got there, and quite frankly, there weren't any African American faces in this magazine. And I start looking at the demographics, and I say, our county's 50% African American. Where are we representing our county properly by not telling stories from that community too? And everybody looked at me and said, I never really thought about that. It wasn't like intentional. It was just something that, sometimes in newsrooms that lack diversity, diversity isn't the first thing that you think of. So we made intentional after that if we're going to represent our community and tell our community stories, we're going to make sure that the entire community is included. So, tell those stories of diversity. Avoid stereotyping. Journalists should examine the ways and values that their experiences may shape their reporting. I mean, sometimes we have to step back and, when you're writing about a topic and say, I don't know, something extreme. I mean, if you're writing about a child abuse case and you were abused as a child, are your experiences going to play into that? And can you separate yourself from those experiences, or do those experiences help you tell the story? I don't know, but sometimes we have to step back, and we have to have those questions. Label, advocacy, and commentary. Generally, commentary would be opinions, something we think. In any appropriate, even TV broadcast, newspaper, website, we are noting that this is an opinion. In the newspaper, it's, if done right, the top of the page says opinion or editorial, and people know that these are those opinions. John McKay, who was the longtime anchor for Channel 8 out of Dallas, he got to where late in his career, at the end of the broadcast sometimes, he would offer an opinion piece on a television. And they always noted, this is John McKay's opinion. This isn't the newscast. Dale Hansen, the old sportscaster, he was really good at sometimes pissing people off with his opinions, but they always noted, this is Dale's opinion. This isn't us reporting the news. Never deliberately distort facts or context. This includes any visual information, illustrations, reenactments. Make sure that all of that is clear. Don't ever distort what you're talking about. I'm going to say this about 3 times. Never plagiarize. Never plagiarize. Never plagiarize. Always attribute, however you want to say it. And this is, y'all have heard this echoed in your academic writing, but the same is true for news writing. If it's not an original opinion, original thought that you came up with, tell us who came up with it, okay? And this isn't just a small newspaper deal. There was a Pulitzer Prize winning story, a Pulitzer Prize that got later retracted at the Washington Post, because as it came out, the whole story was just BS. It was totally fabricated. I told you I was in Paris, Texas. 2 editors before me in Paris, the woman lost her job because it was ridiculous, but she lifted an entire column from the Washington Post, just copied and pasted it into the Paris News. I guess she thought folks in Lamar County didn't read the Washington Post. I don't know. Those are extreme situations, but nonetheless, even the smallest thing, you just have to ask yourself, am I saying this, or did somebody else say it? And if somebody else said it, then tell us who said it. That's responsible. So the first of the 4 principles, seek truth and report it, is probably the longest with the most bullets, but that's that. The second principle is minimize harm, right? Just like doctors, do no harm. Ethical journalism treats subjects, sources, colleagues, and members of the public as the human beings deserving of respect. Um, treating everybody with respect. That's something else my mama used to say. My mother could have been a journalism teacher. You know, it's just tell the truth and treat people with respect. Uh, balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort. Pursuit of news is not a license for arrogance or undue intrusiveness. So this is the fine line between the public's right to know and the victim's right to privacy, right? And these lines are getting blurred with the social media age that we live in. News organizations are struggling with what do we know, what do we report. There's been a lot of instances, and it's happening more and more every day, where somebody lost a loved one in a car accident, and the way they found out about it was on somebody's Facebook page or something. I mean, that's happening more and more. It wasn't the DPS trooper who called and told them, or the chaplain or whatever. So there's more and more of a blurred line. We have had, I think a lot of journalists, a lot of people, I was in the field a long time before I realized, I think we always just kind of thought it was illegal to print minors' names, and if it had to do with a crime, if a minor was arrested for a crime. It's not illegal. Is it unethical? I don't know. We just never did it. That was just kind of a thing that, we might say the 15-year-old male was arrested for possession of marijuana, but we never, printed his name. For a long time, newspapers or news organizations, and when I say newspapers, I mean all this applies to not just newspapers, but to television stations, radio news, whatever. We didn't report about suicides unless it was done so in a public manner. One time at the local feed store, an employee there hung himself on the job, like in the warehouse in front of people. He didn't successfully kill himself, but he hung himself, and that was something that we reported on because it happened in the public. Forever, if suicides happened privately, news organizations didn't pursue them. Some of that was, I think, the public's or the victim's right to privacy. Suicide victim is still a victim. Some of that, there was some studies back in the 70s that showed in communities where suicide was reported about in the news, there was an ensuing increase in suicide attempts in that community. So, now there is the train of thought. There's two trains of thought. I have a friend who's the digital producer at the ABC affiliate in Houston, and he said their policy now is if there's a police tape up, they're going to go try to see what the story is, suicide or not. That everybody's talking about it on social media anyway, that it's our obligation to give them the facts and the straight of the story. I don't know. There is, I think, more and more of a mindset that we can't prevent suicide and get would-be suicide victims help if we don't talk about suicide. So, I don't know. That's just an example of the public's right to know opposed to the victim's right to privacy. Show compassion for those who may be affected by news coverage. Use heightened sensitivity when dealing with juveniles, victims of sex crimes, and sources or subjects who are inexperienced or unable to give consent. Consider cultural differences in approach to this treatment. Then again, we had a story one time. 9-year-old girl had been sexually abused by her grandfather, and small town. You can't not name the criminal because he is the story. We made the decision to just say he was close to his victim, or his victim was a family member or something. because in a small town like that where everybody knows this guy and knows his 4 grandkids or 3 grandkids or whatever, it was just our way, our decision to help try to protect their anonymity as much as possible. In that case, the father of the girl wanted to go on the record, but he didn't want his name to be identified. And of course, we did that. I've been criticized before. Somebody got popped for cooking meth, and we ran his mugshot. He went to prison, ran his mugshot, and told the story. And the criticism there was, in the small town, he's got kids here, and everybody knows who his kids are. I don't know. Maybe he shouldn't cook meth. But these are true. These are, these are questions we have to ask ourselves. I remember in East Texas, in Jefferson, I was the editor of the Jefferson newspaper, and I was at the office one Saturday, and a call went out across the scanner that a 4-year-old boy had drowned at Lake of the Pines. So I, got my camera and went out there, and I got there just in time to see him doing CPR on this little boy, and it was my son was about 4 at the time. It just really hit home, And we wrote the story, told what happened. We did print his name because by then, his obituary was on page 3. Everybody knew. And we closed the story by saying CPS was investigating the case, Child Protective Services. Because they were. State agency, investigation open or whatever. And I got a call from this little boy's mother. And all I could do was listen to her. But by writing that story, and we made her out like she was a monster. And I said, well, ma'am, that wasn't our intent. And, all we said was there was an investigation open. It's a state agency. There's state funds investigating. And she just continued. She was beside herself. And I get it. I would have been too, And you feel like, I don't know, you just listen to them. What I wanted to say to her, in retrospect, was, well, what I didn't put in the story was your little boy wandered off while you and your whole family was drinking and not paying attention. And when 30 volunteers got arm in arm and got out in the water to find your little boy, you and none of your family were sober enough to help do that. And then when they pulled him up on the bank, then you showed up 15 minutes later and yelled, who killed my motherfucking baby? Because that's what happened. That's what I saw. I didn't report any of that. I just said CPS was investigating the case. So that would be a case, an extreme case, and it was a kick in the gut for me where we were doing our best to be respectful, and I still feel that we were. I didn't say any of that to her. I just, expressed my sympathy. We had a kid one time he was a 16-year-old high school kid. The school bus was going down the road on Highway 82 and handed a suicide note to his sister and opened the back hatch of the school bus and jumped out head first. They were on their way home last day before Christmas vacation, so you're working on your Christmas edition, and then all of a sudden the news changes. The superintendent's official report on that was he fell from a moving bus. And I said, man, are you sure you want to say that? That implies liability on the school. We all know what happened, but unless you tell me what happened and I can cite you as a source for what happened, he said, that's the statement I'm going with. And that's what we reported. And, when they took that kid off life support, his family thanked us for our responsible reporting, and it was a bad deal. But, sometimes what happens, but you have to be able to cite how you know what happens. And anyway, those were 2 times I felt like I was kicked in the gut. But you got to show compassion sometimes. It's like I said, when you're dealing with juveniles, victims of sex crimes, compassion is key. especially, I think, in community journalism. Recognize that legal access to information differs from ethical justification to publish or broadcast. Just because we can access something doesn't mean that we necessarily need to publish it. Every autopsy report in the state of Texas is public record. If you really ever want some somber reading, just go pull an autopsy report. We have it. We can publish it. Do we need to publish it? Probably not. They had an incident at the Gainesville Daily Register up in Cook County. It was I guess 2 kids were in their daddy's truck one Saturday afternoon playing, 4-year-old, 5-year-old kid. It was a freak deal, but they were playing in his truck and they kicked it into neutral and it started rolling, and one kid fell out and fell under the tire and the truck rolled over. And the young reporter there at the time, he didn't know any better, or he should have known better. I don't know. I'm telling this story. If you're ever a young reporter, you should know better. But he pulled the officer's incident report, and those incident reports are public record. And they're usually extremely detailed and extremely graphic sometimes because it's evidence in court, right? They have to take down every detail they can. And the guy wrote the story, the editor there didn't check it. And the story that went out in the paper went into detail about how when officers arrived, the boy was bleeding from the mouth and the father was performing CPR, and it just all this graphic detail, The editor lost his job over the deal because he should have caught it, and the reporter wasn't there much longer. It's a great example of, there's nothing illegal. It's public record, but my mama used to say, it's not what you say, it's the way you say it, right? So there's some compassion. Realize that private people have a greater right to control information about themselves than public figures and others who seek power, influence, attention. Weigh the consequences of publishing or broadcasting personal information. I do think that public people are under greater public scrutiny. We might apply greater scrutiny to Dr. Hurley or, the county judge, or, if you're in elected office, I think you do subject yourself to a higher scrutiny of the press. We might scrutinize more somebody in the public eye than a private citizen. Avoid pandering for lurid curiosity, even if others do. I was telling somebody the other day, telling the class this morning that in the wake of the Cowboys game the other night, I guess somebody on some sports website wrote a 800-word story speculating on a 7-word tweet that Dak Prescott, put out on Twitter. There's no sourcing to it. It was really just kind of reporting it like it was fact, like lurid curiosity, as it is quoted here. Get out of the gutter. Report what you know, report what you see, report what you hear. Balance the suspect's right to a fair trial with the public's right to know. Consider the implications of identifying criminal suspects and their legal charges. Somebody is not guilty until they're proven so in a court of law, and it's a balancing act sometimes. If you a newspaper can be held liable for, if you imply or print something false about a suspect in a crime, they can be held liable for that. There have been instances where impartial juries couldn't be found because of excessive press coverage around something. I would argue that, who was it? Oh, Lord. Last semester, the couple that got in a fight and the girl got killed, and then they found the boyfriend dead. Y'all remember this? They were like, they were like on a road trip. I can't remember. Yeah, I can't remember. I can't believe, because in this class last semester, we talked about it every day,
Yeah, we talked about it a lot in Dr. Anderson's class
Yeah.
this semester.
If that had ever gone to trial, how would that guy have ever gotten a fair trial with all, it was all pretty cut and dry, but until you're proven guilty, that's an expression called being tried in the court of public opinion. So You know, I guess he offed himself and took care of that. But yeah, that was a. Now they're saying that the police maybe have the police stopped him before because they let him go, or I don't know. They may come up on charges. Avoid long-term implications of extended reach and permanence of a publication. We have a new notion these days called what we call, you're hearing more and more about, the right to be forgotten. Say, in the day, the day and age of the internet, once it's out there, right? The Associated Press is even recommending now that we don't name those who are arrested for minor misdemeanor offenses. You may have an instance where somebody was popped for marijuana when they were 18 years old, and 20 years later they're having a hard time getting a job because when you do a Google search for that person, it comes up. So the right to be forgotten, and as a writer, you have to constantly be thinking, once we put this out there, it is out there. So one more thing on minimize harm before we go on to the next two. Show compassion for those who may be affected by news coverage and treat everybody fairly. This includes the grandfather who's on trial for molesting his granddaughter. You have to be fair to everybody in the story. And that monster, you have to, in your writing, treat them like the human being that they are too. And it's tough sometimes. But that's always something for consideration. So, all right, moving on here. Any questions so far? Comments? It's all about what Mommy used to say. Let's be honest. Okay. Act independently. That's the third principle. So the highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. To do this, you should avoid conflicts of interest, whether they're real or perceived. If a conflict of interest is unavoidable, you should disclose that. So you're on the rodeo team here. If we wanted, somebody here is, you're on the rodeo team. Okay, I'm sorry. If we wanted to write a story for the TNS or for this class about somebody on the rodeo team, you would not be the person to write that story, okay? So you could serve as a source for somebody else to write that story, but if it's a group that you're involved with or a member of, where you want to avoid that, if at all possible. I told you about me being on the city council. There's Callie Smith is the publisher in Stamford, Texas, and when she got elected to the school board there, they made public their procedure to let people know that she wasn't going to be reporting or touching or having anything to do with the education reporting there. You want to avoid the conflicts of interest if possible. If you can't avoid them, you need to put them out there. On NPR, I heard this morning they were reporting about Facebook, and it was a news story about something bad that Facebook's doing these days, and they put it out there at the beginning that Facebook is a financial sponsor of NPR. So it's like, we're reporting on them. They give us money, so we're just letting you know that we're covering this like any other news story, but we're putting it out there. Small towns and community journalism, you're not going to avoid all conflicts of interest all the time. A lot of these small towns that a lot of us are from, if one person only does one thing to avoid a conflict of interest with something else, then nothing's going to get done. So you just want to put them out there. refuse gifts, favors, fees, free travel, or special treatment, and avoid any political or other outside activities that may compromise integrity or impartiality or damage your credibility. I have been at newspapers before that it was a part of our employment contract that you weren't allowed to publicly campaign for a local race. You weren't allowed to have a political sign in your yard. You weren't allowed to wear a button. If you did, this isn't at all places, but if you did want to run from office, you had to resign your job to go run for office. Nonetheless, we want to try to remain as impartial as we can. Be wary of sources offering information or favors for money. Do not pay for access to the news. Identify content provided by outside sources, whether paid or not. We don't need to be paying for the information. Deny favored treatment to advertisers, donors, or any other special interest, and resist internal or external pressure to influence coverage. The case I talked about earlier about the guy who hung himself in the feed store, somebody in the office said, well, don't you think you ought to call Tim, the guy that owns the feed store, and see what he thinks about it? He's a big advertiser. It may piss him off. And I said, no, I don't think I should, This was an advertising person that said that, but the news is the news and advertising is advertising, and you try to delineate between those lines. Distinguish news from advertising and shun hybrids that blur the lines between the two. Prominently labeled sponsored content. We have a new phenomenon in television news called sponsored content. A video I'm going to share with you to watch talks a lot about this. It talks about it in a funny way. You may turn on one of these television morning shows and they may do an 8 or 10 minute segment about a new business or a new product or whatever. And you're thinking, well, this is just a business feature, right? They've gone out and come to find out, and a lot of people, they aren't telling you that it is. It's what's actually called sponsored content, where that company is paying for that time. So it's kind of disguised as the news, but it's really not. It's an ad. And on this video I'm going to send you, John Oliver, they did a little experiment on his show where they made up this bogus company with this bogus, it was an absurd, bogus product, and approached some TV stations and bought, this stuff actually aired. It aired, and it was completely bogus because these stations aren't doing any background on these people that are paying for time. So that's the concept of sponsored content, and you gotta let folks know that that's what it is. So seek truth, minimize harm, act independently. The fourth principle is be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decisions. Explain ethical choices and processes for audiences. Encourage a civil dialogue with the public about the journalistic practices, coverage, and news content. So the decisions that we make, we need to be held accountable for those decisions when asked. If somebody calls and says, hey, why did you report about this and not this? You have these processes and these conversations in place. You need to respond quickly to questions about accuracy, clarity, and fairness. If somebody emails you and says, hey, you got this wrong, you need to respond as quick as you can and try to make it right. Make sure that you got it wrong and then make it right. Acknowledge mistakes and correct them promptly and prominently explain corrections and clarifications. I've worked for people that would not issue a correction unless somebody called us out on it and said, hey, you got this wrong. If we found the mistake on our own, but nobody else said anything about it, we just leave it alone. That's not the proper way to do it. You find a mistake, it just bodes to your credibility. You want to make sure that you are honest and on the level with people. Expose unethical conduct in journalism, including within your organizations. how many times in the past, whatever, have news organizations had to report about stuff that went wrong in their organization. Matt Lauer and the NBC deal, I don't know if y'all know who I'm talking about, comes to mind,
The Today Show.
yeah, the Today Show, they had to report about that. They said this is where we have to talk about what went wrong here. In the Me Too, I think there was a time 3 or 4 years ago when we were in the middle of the Me Too movement. I mean, you saw this a lot, where news organizations were having to tell people that they got it wrong. Abide by the same high standards that you expect of others. So then again, don't be a hypocrite. If you think that your competitor needs to be doing something a certain way, you need to be doing it as well. So we're getting down to time. I hope I have got you thinking about some things. I will get the course opened and the syllabus up and all this afternoon, this evening. I'll see y'all on Thursday, okay? Thank you.